The JFK 35 podcast is made possible through generous support from the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation.
We do not want a war. We do not now expect a war. This generation of Americans has already had enough, more than enough, of war and hate and oppression.
Amidst a growing nuclear threat from the Soviet Union, Americans wondered what would be next. After the Cuban Missile Crisis the previous fall in 1962, President Kennedy laid out a new path in a speech at American University the following spring in 1963.
We are not helpless before that task, or hopeless of its success. Confident and unafraid, we must labor on, not towards a strategy of annihilation, but towards a strategy of peace.
I'm Matt Porter, and today we look at President Kennedy and his legacy towards a more peaceful world. Next on Let Us Begin Episode 2, Peace for All Time.
All this will not be finished in the first 100 days, nor will it be finished in the first 1,000 days, nor in the life of this administration, nor even perhaps in our lifetime on this planet. But let us begin.
On June 10th, 1963, less than a year after the world came to the brink of nuclear war in the Cuban Missile Crisis, President John F. Kennedy gave a speech at American University laying out a path forward out of the shadows of nuclear war and into the light of a more peaceful world.
Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again.
That day, two American University graduates, Sherry Muller and Margaret Van Narsen, were at the commencement ceremonies listening to the president. They knew they were living through a key moment in American history as they remembered where they were during the speech.
I had this opportunity to stay after the semester was over and hand out programs at commencement. I was only 20 at the time and really wanted the opportunity to see our president. And it was I remember telling my parents, I really want to stay late. You don't need to pick me up till later to go home to Illinois.
It was also an extremely hot day, and we were sitting out in the athletic field and having black robes, trying to figure out minimally what we could wear underneath it that we would to be comfortable. I was just listening for some kind of sense of hope. Can we get out of all of this, and how do we move forward?
We do not want a war. We do not now expect a war. This generation of Americans has already had enough, more than enough, of war and hate and oppression. We shall be prepared if others wish it. We shall be alert to try to stop it. But we shall also do our part to build a world of peace where the weak are safe and the strong are just. We are not helpless before that task, or hopeless of its success. Confident and unafraid, we must labor on, not towards a strategy of annihilation, but towards a strategy of peace.
He talks about how nuclear war is unthinkable and that we all would be, for better or for worse, wiped out in 24 hours. He's very articulate about the cost of it and that he hopes we would never push an enemy so far into a corner that literally to save face, they would strike, even knowing that it would rain disaster on their own country.
Historian and JFK biographer Fredrik Logevall says in JFK's short 3-year presidency, the strategy of peace speech he gave that day was one of the most important addresses by a president in the 20th century.
It's an extraordinary speech by Kennedy arguing for a strategy of peace. arguing for diversity, arguing for, in a sense, a kind of common humanity. And that, yes, we will have our differences in politics, as we should, including international politics. But we ultimately have to think about the future of the planet.
The speech was not just well received in the United States, it also resonated with the president's chief adversary, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev.
Khrushchev ordered that the text of Kennedy's speech be made available to be printed for all Soviets to see, for all Russians to see. That tells us something about Khrushchev's thinking, that he wants to meet Kennedy where he is going with this speech. So it's domestic opinion, it's international opinion, it's even the man in the Kremlin who is receptive to this.
Today, Logevall says the speech provides a blueprint for nuclear diplomacy that other leaders would be wise to follow.
So all of us, and especially leaders in this country and elsewhere, would be well advised, it seems to me, to go back, read the American University speech, reflect on what John F. Kennedy says in that remarkable speech, and act accordingly.
And now, joining me to discuss how JFK's strategy of peace continues to resonate today is former Secretary of Energy, Dr. Ernest Moniz. As the Energy Secretary, Dr. Moniz helped work on initiatives to strengthen nuclear security at home and abroad. And after leaving the Energy Department, Dr. Moniz serves as the co-chair and CEO of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, which works to prevent the use and spread of nuclear weapons, nuclear terrorism, and catastrophic biological events. Dr. Moniz, thank you for joining me today.
It's a pleasure, Matt.
This episode is about President Kennedy's legacy when it comes to peace, and also his work to try to start to reduce the proliferation of nuclear weapons. But before we get into that, can you tell us a little bit about yourself in your career when it's come to nuclear threats, both as the Secretary of Energy and your work now with the NTI?
Sure. Well, first of all, NTI, as a non-governmental organization, has been actually in business, shall we say, since the early 2001, founded by Sam Nunn, former senator of Georgia, who, of course, especially with his colleague, Republican Senator Dick Lugar, seriously helped address the nuclear challenges following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Sam Nunn and Ted Turner founded the organization, and we are dedicated to looking at, I think, clearly presenting policies that can lower the risks of nuclear use and biological use or bioweapons. But in addition to having systemic change that can lead to, for example, new international organizations also helping with risk reduction. And of course, we can come back and discuss that if there's time. In terms of my own career, way back when, in the late 1970s, my mentor on the MIT physics faculty, Hermann Feshbach, who was very, very dedicated to nuclear risk reduction, as well as issues like human rights and the like, as advanced by the scientific community. Hermann, I won't go into the coercive tactics he used, but let's just say he got me involved in a major American Physical Society study on nuclear fuel cycles. And I did that. And indeed, within that study, I led the chapter on nonproliferation issues and safeguards issues with nuclear facilities. That then became one of the threads in my career all the way up to NTI. Certainly, when I was Department of Energy Undersecretary in the Clinton administration, we spent really a lot of time working in Russia, trying to reduce nuclear risks by controlling nuclear materials. And then, of course, as secretary, that theme again was picked up, for example, with President Obama initiating the nuclear security summits, which was the first time that heads of state of many, many countries came together to address nuclear risks. So those are a few of the dots to connect, if you like, in a career in which nuclear risk reduction has certainly been an important theme.
So your career has been so involved in reducing the proliferation of these weapons. I want to take us back now briefly to the Cuban Missile Crisis, sort of the first time I think maybe you could say the world woke up, particularly maybe Americans woke up to how close nuclear war could be to on their doorstep. And that crisis led to JFK and Khrushchev agreeing for the first time to a limited test ban treaty 60 years ago this year. Some people who lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis say the treaty was the second time the world was saved after the Cuban Missile Crisis. What are your thoughts on how that developed and how significant the limited test ban treaty was going forward, and how important it was just for that agreement alone for the prevention of nuclear proliferation?
Well, first of all, I would reinforce the idea that it was very important, but let's take a step back. When President Kennedy took office, and of course, we all know that his tenure as president was regrettably shorter than we would have liked, but even in that period, he really had a strong emphasis on nuclear security and nuclear nonproliferation. In fact, the negotiations with the Soviet Union and with Khrushchev had started well before the Cuban Missile Crisis. There were ups and downs for sure, but really in the first year of his presidency, those discussions started. Then the Cuban Missile Crisis, as you said, was probably still to this day. We can come back to Ukraine later on, but still to this day, the Cuban Missile Crisis probably was the greatest time of danger in terms of nuclear weapons being used. And I think President Kennedy, showed a very sure hand, frankly, in negotiating through that. Although, even though he was in many ways our adversary, I would have to give credit to Khrushchev as well, as particularly coming out of the Cuban Missile Crisis, understanding that there was a joint responsibility of the United States and the Soviet Union to avoid nuclear catastrophe, and as the possessors of by far the largest stockpiles, to take a leadership role in doing that. President Kennedy, I don't want to skip over his very important address at American University, the Cuban Missile Crisis in late 1962, the president's American University speech in June of 63 at the commencement, where he made a very compelling case around international peace and around the great risks of nuclear weapons, obviously still probably shaking a little bit from the Cuban Missile Crisis, and speeding, if anything, the completion of the negotiations for the partial test ban treaty, which the U.S. and Russia announced later that summer, and which came into effect, in fact, later on that year in 1963. So the partial test ban treaty was, in many ways, the first really significant step linking nonproliferation of nuclear weapons with the question of test bans. It eliminated tests in the atmosphere, in space, in the oceans, not underground, but still a major step, particularly because the atmospheric tests were not just advancing nuclear weaponry, but of course were leading to fallout questions that many societies, including our own, were getting pretty concerned about. And so the test ban treaty, the partial test ban treaty that President Kennedy really, together with Khrushchev, led into its existence, accomplished both nonproliferation goals and public health goals from the point of view of eliminating atmospheric fallout, or at least eliminating Russian and American origin radioactive fallout. I would just then add that while we have not yet succeeded in getting a comprehensive test ban through, and we all know where that stands, and can discuss that more, which would be an even stronger step, in my view, for helping our nonproliferation objectives be realized. But we also should look at the bright side, in the sense that the discussions about the CTBT in the late 1990s, in particular, did follow the moratorium on tests that both the Soviet Union and then Russia and the United States, and now all of the P5, that is the permanent members of the UN Security Council, have observed. So even without a treaty, the comprehensive test ban spirit, if you like, is being followed, with the only country in this century to test nuclear weapons being North Korea. Well, that's another story to discuss. But really, that period in the early 1960s really was a major swing towards this direction of nuclear risk reduction and nonproliferation.
So I obviously don't want to forget that speech, which is often referred to as the strategy of peace speech by Kennedy, as he sort of lays out an approach on trying to get rid of these disastrous weapons. Looking back as someone who has been part of American policy for nuclear nonproliferation, how has the speech that Kennedy gave from American University, how does that still resonate with American policy after the fact 60 years later?
Well, first of all, the first bit of news is it does resonate. I have seen that speech referred to multiple times in the last several years, mostly in the context of, frankly, those of us certainly in the business, if you like, hoping for similarly strategic views of the path forward. Now, clearly, as we've already discussed, President Kennedy was quite appropriately taken with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and having managed through that was, I think, thinking hard about the steps to advance peace, to advance nonproliferation. But I think we should also remember that President Kennedy took these steps, including the American University speech, at a time when there was a lot of clamor for much more hawkish views, because, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis led others to conclude the opposite, I think, of what should have been concluded and was concluded by President Kennedy, namely that this just showed the fragility of the peace that we had, with many, many thousands, in fact, reaching tens of thousands of nuclear weapons possessed by each side. So I think that speech came at a time, as I said, when there were many hawkish views. The president wisely put forward a vision driven by peace. And I must say that if we fast forward to today, when we have extreme tensions with China, when we have the Russian invasion of Ukraine and nuclear saber rattling as a result, we believe that it is a time as well today to think about strategically lowering the temperature, certainly with regard to nuclear weapons, and decreasing the risk, as opposed to, unfortunately, the increase in risk that we have seen recently. We've said many times that the nuclear saber rattling around the Ukraine situation, obviously saber rattling by President Putin and other high-ranking Russian officials, that probably has brought us to the most dangerous nuclear moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I think we need, again, leadership and diplomacy in a strategic sense to make sure we get through this period, ideally on a trajectory to once again lower the temperature and decrease the risk.
And speaking of that, when we spoke to historians about the Cuban Missile Crisis, one thing they commented on was it didn't devolve to war because both leaders, both Khrushchev and Kennedy, at some point, understood the great danger of nuclear weapons and did not want to actually go through with using them. Today, it's not just a U.S.-Soviet dichotomy, right? It's not just two superpowers. Now we're talking about North Korea, other powers that have access to nuclear weapons. Are there concerns, or what are the differences today that maybe is either good or not, or concerning, as far as to make sure that something like the Cuban Missile Crisis does not repeat itself in today, where it's not just two leaders that we're worried about, we might be worried about multiple threats?
Well, certainly there are multiple concerns on the nuclear front, and we can come back to those. But let me first start with a little bit of the bright side, namely that certainly in the 50s, going up to the Kennedy presidency and perhaps beyond, there was certainly an expectation expressed quite often that we would experience globally much, much more proliferation of nuclear weapons than has proved to be the case. And again, I do think that the actions taken in the early 60s helped change that vector. We do now have 9 states with nuclear weapons. So the regime has been imperfect, but 9 is a lot better than the 25 or so that was often projected up to the Kennedy presidency. Now, today, North Korea obviously is a concern. India, Pakistan are a concern. The Mideast situation is a concern. Iran does not have nuclear weapons today, but clearly has got a lot of capability to have them if they choose. But I would point out to one problem that probably stands out among others, and that is with China very clearly building a much more substantial nuclear weapon stockpile. American intelligence has said publicly the expectations are for about 1,500 Chinese nuclear weapons by, say, 2035. So let's say a decade roughly in time frame. That, first of all, the whole regime of arms control, which you might say the Partial Test Ban Treaty in 1963 was one of the early steps in that negotiation between the United States and the Soviet Union, subsequently the United States and Russia, in terms of equality, some form of equality of nuclear weapons or delivery vehicles. That paradigm is now challenged if there is a third country with a near peer nuclear weapon stockpile. So we need a new strategic paradigm as China builds up its stockpile to avoid blunder or miscalculation that could lead to potentially a nuclear exchange that nobody really wants. However, I hate to say it, but I'm certainly concerned about even other spillover effects beyond the 3 countries with large stockpiles, because frankly, I think it's hard to imagine China increasing its stockpile by an order of magnitude without having India have some form of response. And then if India responds, it's hard to imagine that happening without Pakistan responding. And so we could and have to work to head off a danger where really a handful of countries potentially end up with pretty substantial nuclear weapon stockpiles, greatly increasing the risk of an accident occurring, if you like, that could lead to escalation. So that's certainly a concern, but I'll go back once more and repeat that the situation in Ukraine, we certainly hope will not escalate to the use of a nuclear weapon, but we cannot sit here today and be entirely confident that that will be the case.
You mentioned, President Kennedy in 1960 was dealing with a very hawkish attitude towards nuclear weapons. There was a lot of people that just says you have to have more missiles than the other guy. And that's just the way it is, sort of like overwhelming force. And Kennedy gave that strategy of peace, sort of outlining a different way to approach it, and that was a bit of a turning point. If a president, like say President Biden, would have to go out there and give the 2023 version of a strategy of peace speech, what would be part of his strategy to address the problems you just mentioned?
Well, first of all, I think there are some steps being taken that we should not overlook. For example, the G7 meeting of 2023 was the first time that the leaders of the G7 put out a joint statement on nuclear weapons issues, reasserting the Reagan-Gorbachev sentiment that nuclear war is fundamentally unwinnable and therefore should not be fought, underpinning the aspiration that remains and is encoded in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, that the nuclear weapon states work towards eventual elimination of nuclear weapons. And also, President Biden, together with the Congress, has taken a step that probably has not gotten as much public attention, but we believe is very important, namely doing once again, and by once again, I mean for the first time in 30 years, what's called a fail-safe review in terms of making sure we can avoid, again, blunders or miscalculations leading to a nuclear exchange. Now, that fail-safe review is now being done at a time when, 30 years later, an awful lot has changed in technology. The whole issues around cybersecurity, particularly now with a stockpile that has, been modernized in many ways with more digital capabilities. These are new kinds of threats. And so having the United States first take a look at how we can secure those weapons is very important. We are, in addition, working towards internationalizing this. That is, every country with nuclear weapons, we hope, would follow this lead and look at their own stockpiles and the security of those stockpiles against miscalculation or accidental launch. So that's very important. However, there's also more to be done. And your question about what might a President Biden do, I believe there is going on, and the president's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, has already alluded to this, that as we look ahead a decade and more to when, as I said earlier, China, for example, has a much bigger arsenal, the administration has already made the point that we need a new paradigm. We cannot just look at equating the numbers of nuclear weapons, for example, or launchers that various countries have. We need to think in terms of the overall security environment. The reality is that we have major regional security challenges. Now with Ukraine, we have a Euro-Atlantic security challenge. We obviously have the Asian security challenges around China, North Korea, South Korea, Japan, et cetera. We have the India-Pakistan regional challenge. And I believe that as the technology continues to evolve, broadly speaking, we will need these new paradigms that start out by looking not just at nuclear, but at the overall security context, which involves nuclear, but it involves conventional weapons. It involves the threat matrix. It involves diplomacy, many factors which come into, I think, a new definition of overall security and certainly nuclear security.
And I just have one last question. That was a wonderful answer. But the final question, I want to wrap it back to President Kennedy. And what can leaders learn regarding his approach to the Soviets, his experience in Cuba, or the way he came to the agreement with Khrushchev on the limited test ban treaty? What can leaders learn, if anything, from his work?
Well, I think the lesson remains the critically important one that President Kennedy, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, faced a really tough, very, very tense situation. He, I think, very skillfully, and again with Khrushchev, resolved that, and then did not take the lesson of reflexively resorting to what you might call the hawkish approach, as opposed to looking strategically at how to turn down the temperature and work towards non-proliferation, work towards more nuclear strategic stability, which we did manage to sustain for many decades. And I'm certainly hoping that today's tensions, particularly those developed with Russia's Ukraine invasion, lead us to finding the same kind of wisdom to look beyond the immediate and to be thinking in terms of long-term risk reduction for the sake of all of our countries.
Dr. Moniz, thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Very good. Hope it's helpful.
President Kennedy's legacy of peace goes beyond nuclear diplomacy and national security. In 1961, Kennedy established the Peace Corps, a new agency and new opportunity for Americans to serve the world. 62 years later, the organization allows Americans with unique experiences ranging from economics to engineering to volunteer in aid projects at home and abroad. Joining me now is the current director of the Peace Corps, Carol Spahn. Director Spahn, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, we're so glad you're here and able to talk to us. The first thing I want to touch base on is tell us a little bit about how you ended up coming to the Peace Corps. I understand you are a former volunteer, so if you want to just tell us a little bit about your relationship with the Peace Corps and how you've found your way to the director's seat.
Well, Peace Corps has just been part of my life ever since I joined in 1994 as a small business development volunteer in post-communist Romania. And like so many people who joined the Peace Corps, it just became part of who I was. And following my service, worked with a variety of international nonprofits and found myself really wanting to get back out into the field and to connect again with people around the world with different cultures in a more personal way. And so I joined as a Peace Corps country director in 2014, moved my family, including my 2 teenage daughters, to Malawi, which is a beautiful country called the warm heart of Africa in southeastern Africa. And I stayed there as a country director for 5 years. And it was just so incredibly powerful. And I probably had about 500 volunteers come through Peace Corps in Malawi during my term there, and met some of the most amazing and dedicated people who just poured themselves into their work. It was incredibly inspirational. Joined then the HQ team in 2019, just a few months shy of the first ever global evacuation. So it has been a very intense ride with the Peace Corps through a very challenging time in its history. And I was incredibly honored to be asked to step into the acting director role for the Biden administration, and then was later nominated and confirmed as the director. So although I've been the official director only for a few short months, I've been in the seat for over 2 years.
And certainly a lot of past experience with the Peace Corps before the director's seat. It's clearly been a meaningful part of your life. If you want to share maybe a few of the experiences that really made a difference in how you think about the Peace Corps and led to how you value it today.
Well, I can say that when I started in the Peace Corps as a volunteer in, again, post-communist Romania, this was a time following the Cold War, and we all had a lot of perceptions about sort of what was happening and about democracy and what the world might look like following the fall of the wall and the opening of these many countries. And what I learned during my time with Peace Corps, and I think this is true of almost every volunteer I've ever spoken with, is that there is something incredibly transformational about learning another language, integrating into another culture, and being there for 2 years. And that 2 years really does enable you to understand a culture and a different way of viewing the world. And it is truly something that you never lose. And so that really is something I've brought into every role that I've been in, in the Peace Corps. And it is just a value system and an ethos that is part of the broad Peace Corps network, which we include volunteers, staff, our host families, our counterparts, just this global network of grassroots change makers who value connecting across difference, who value really the skills that are embedded in a community and who are willing to take action. And the way that that shows up now is with every returned volunteer. We have more than 240,000 people who have served in over 140 countries around the world. And any volunteer that I meet, regardless of where they served, there is an instant connection with them because of that shared ethos, that shared value system. And I have a colleague who said, where else could you possibly work where you work for 2 years and it ends up being a part of your identity for the rest of your life? And people get tattoos of the Peace Corps. They, put Peace Corps in their bios, and it is even in obituaries. So it's just a beautifully transformational agency and opportunity, and something that I would wish everyone had the opportunity to do.
And, you look at this global community of citizens who've chosen to go out and do this. John F. Kennedy, during his tenure, was dealing with the Soviet Union and the threat of nuclear annihilation at points in the presidency. But he said it wasn't just about what the diplomats and what he was doing to reach across the ocean to the Soviet Union, but he had this idea that the Peace Corps and these regular Americans would also help play a role in international development and global diplomacy. How have you seen that idea? Has it been realized? What does it look like to you now in 2023?
Well, I can't imagine what President Kennedy was facing at that time, and the pace at which the Peace Corps was founded and stood up, and the global response, both from countries that wanted volunteers and people who were interested in going, is just amazing. Sergeant Shriver and those who were part of that initial leadership team just achieved miracles. It's very, very inspiring to think about what was happening then and to think about what's happening now post-COVID. We just went through a historic time when every country around the world was isolated in different ways, and not just countries, families, communities, borders were closed and things were shut down. And that was a tremendous shock to the global system. And so as Peace Corps is rebuilding post-COVID, I think about sort of that time when it started, and the incredible potential and demand for Peace Corps at this moment in history. And everywhere I have been, I have heard from ministers, presidents, students, all across the board about how much Peace Corps has meant to them. And these are, our host country partners, and what it means more broadly for Peace Corps to be engaged at the grassroots level in their country. And what started then in 1961, I talk about as almost an experiment. It was founded on some of the principles of an experiment in international living, and this idea that public diplomacy from, and I won't call them regular Americans, extraordinary Americans who go out and serve in the Peace Corps, what kind of impact that would have over time. And I have had the pleasure of being in several countries that were celebrating 55, 60 years of partnership with the Peace Corps. And it is this cumulative effect of pride, both for the volunteer being connected long-term to that country, to their host family, to their counterparts, and inside the country, really that recognition of having someone from America who cares enough to learn their language and live in their community side by side for an extended period of time means something powerful. And I have had officials from ministries show up in my office again and again and again and tell me about the volunteer who taught them, the volunteer who impacted them, or even the volunteer who lived in their community who they may not have known but knew about. And that is a powerful force, a powerful celebration of just goodwill between individuals that really pays forward in decades. And as I think about it right now, so, in the 60s and 70s, we didn't have all of the tools that we have now to stay connected. Now, volunteers go out, they work in their community, they stay connected to their host family, to people they've worked with literally for the rest of their lives. And this comes to play in very, very powerful ways. We saw it when war broke out in Ukraine. Some of the very first people responding, reaching out, were returned Peace Corps volunteers checking in with their host families, checking in and providing information, providing grassroots support. They were able to mobilize very, very quickly, in support of their communities back in Ukraine. And our teams in Moldova, right next door, it was the same. So that really highlighted for me the long-term impact of people who care about a country, who care about a place, and who are willing to take action.
That's such a powerful story and really fits, I think, with what President Kennedy hoped the Corps could be. President Kennedy talked a lot about the new frontier, which in the 1960s, was very apparent. You had new generations. You had two countries that were looking to space, to explore space for the first time. I want to look at the new frontier of the 2000s, the 21st century. Where do you see the Peace Corps going in the next 5, 10, 20 years? And do you envision that it will remain as strong as it is today?
Absolutely. Peace Corps will remain as strong as it is today, and the importance of Peace Corps can and will only grow. The importance of connecting across difference, of working together, of building bridges at the grassroots level, at the personal level, that will not go away. And I often say we can support countries in any number of ways. People may or may not remember who built the school or the hospital, but they will always remember the person who cared enough to show up and to spend time with them. And as I said earlier, to learn the language. Right now, we are seeing the biggest generation of youth in history. And we are really focusing on that young population in the countries we serve to connect those grassroots change makers in some of the most underserved, marginalized communities to opportunity, to give them voice at the table, and to really look for those opportunities. As I am out talking with our host partners, they are also looking to see how they can engage these young leaders as change agents for their countries. One of the ways, interestingly, that they have talked about the need is in English education, and English as the language of opportunity and as the language of business, as the language of connection. And that has been a core part of Peace Corps' work for many, many generations. And interestingly, it is showing up significantly right now. I've had ministers say to me that we can teach anything once people can learn and understand English, because it is the language of the internet. So that is coming through very significantly, and we are seeing new ways to connect. We, like many other organizations during the pandemic, had to adapt significantly and have started a virtual service pilot program where we can engage people with significant expertise who might not be able to otherwise leave home. They might have family, they might have other commitments, but they really have something to offer in the world. And so we are also looking to leverage different kinds of service models to be able to bring new and different kinds of expertise and people to the table. So lots of exciting work happening. And I think it really leverages Peace Corps' approach that has the principles of which have really stayed consistent over the last 60 years, which is about local ownership and localization and really building off of what is already in the community to look at sustainable models for community development.
Well, that's awesome and super encouraging. It's good to know that the Peace Corps is in strong hands. The last question that I just want to bring back is to President Kennedy. Obviously, a lot of your volunteers, as you just said, don't have any living memory of the president. In fact, are probably far, far removed from his time in office. What of John F. Kennedy still resonates with the Peace Corps or Peace Corps volunteers today?
There is so much about what President Kennedy really brought to his presidency and to the Peace Corps that speaks to people today. I'll start by pivoting just for a moment. We recently opened our first ever post in Vietnam. And it was a very emotional time for people who had worked on securing that relationship for more than 15 years. And one of the people I met had served in the 60s and spoke about hearing President Kennedy talk about the Peace Corps and how much it inspired him to really become a global citizen. And again, following the pandemic where people were really isolated, people also want to get out. They want to make connections. They want to be a part of the solution. And I think it's an important time to really lean back into the words of President Kennedy and ask, what are you willing to do? And we have done that through a bold invitation campaign that is really challenging this next generation to be a part of the action, to get out there, to make a difference, and to take that, bold step following what was a tremendously destabilizing time for all of us.
The notion of global citizenship is so important, and especially here at the Presidential Library. Director Spahn, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your thoughts on the Peace Corps, a very important piece of President Kennedy's legacy, who we're celebrating with this episode. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
To achieve lasting peace, President Kennedy would have to confront his country's greatest adversary, Premier Nikita Khrushchev and the Soviet Union. Since the mid-50s, both nations were locked in a Cold War, seeking to grow their spheres of influence in other parts of the world. Internally, Kennedy worried about the two nations, both with sizable nuclear stockpiles, erupting into a shooting war.
I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. I call upon him further to abandon this course of world domination and to join in an historic effort to end the perilous arms race and to transform the history of man. Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved.
Next on Let Us Begin, we will look at one of the chief focal points of the Cold War, the city of Berlin, and how Kennedy worked tirelessly through his final months in office to keep the peace in a city divided by the world's two reigning superpowers.